Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're going to focus in on inclusion, diversity and inclusion, the whole aspect to this. And I'm delighted to have multiple book writer, Paolo Gaudiano, who is a multiple winning author, if you like, because I came across you at the British Business Book Awards and you won the Best International Book there, Paolo, but also there's lots and lots of other awards that you come across. So the book Measuring Inclusion, it's a great read, and you're going to take us through it. But actually, it's doing really well. But I know that's not just what you do. So would you like to introduce yourself and position your role and how this book sits amongst what you do?
Yes, thank you, Lucinda. I really appreciate the introduction. I'm Paolo Gaudiano, as you said. Excellent pronunciation. I really appreciate that. And I would say, we initially got into contact because I know that you saw that my book, Measuring Inclusion, won an best international business book by the British Business Book Awards. And I was very fortunate to have won a couple of other awards. I've been a finalist in two and a winner in another one, which is all great. But really, to me, what matters a lot is the fact that I work in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion from a somewhat unique angle. I came into it from initially an academic career that was focused on understanding things about how the brain works, how people work, and eventually became an entrepreneur. And I spent about 15 years helping large organizations understand how they could manage their employees, as well as customer client insights kind of things. And all of it was grounded in analytics. And then about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, I had a little bit of a light bulb moment where I realized that some of the complexities that I was seeing in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion were things that I might be able to address using my unique analytical approach, which is really all about how do you quantify the link between what happens to an individual and as a result of their environment, their connections with other people, their interactions, and how that influences the success of the organization as a whole. And so about 10 years ago, I got excited about that work. I dropped everything. I worked on these computer simulations, which are the bread and butter of the background of what what led me to this work. And I basically proved to myself that it was possible to make a financial argument for why companies can actually make more money by treating their employees better. And that's what led to the work. I've done quite a bit of consulting. We help companies with this idea of measuring not just diversity. In fact, we stay away from measuring diversity and really focus on measuring inclusion, which is the subject of the book. And that's why I'm here today. Very excited to talk to you.
Gosh, there's lots to go at there, actually. And you're talking to me from New York, aren't you? Which is interesting. I was just thinking building a business case for diversity, equity and inclusion in America at the moment is probably quite an important thing to do, given that it's seen as a fluffy nice to have. So you've definitely got some business benefits to this.
And it's very, I would say it's very timely or adequate to point out some of the issues in the United States right now, where DEI has become very much of an unwelcome word. And I think that the fact that I've been recognized with some awards, including some of the United States, in spite of that backlash, in spite of that climate, speaks volumes to the fact that the book manages to avoid some of those pitfalls and some of the controversy that has surrounded other approaches to DEI. And really, ultimately, what it boils down to is the fact that most diversity, equity, and inclusion work has really focused primarily on diversity as a metric of progress and as a target. And I have been speaking for quite a long time. In 2018, I wrote an article in which I suggested that focusing on diversity as the primary or the sole target is actually a mistake. And I suggested in 2018 that it may lead to backlash, because ultimately it's very difficult to get out of that zero-sum game mindset that, hey, if you're going to increase the number of women, it means you're decreasing the number of men, or the percentages, I should say. If you're increasing the percentage of people with disabilities, it means that you're decreasing the percentage of people who do not have disabilities. And that kind of mindset can be very harmful. And it's actually a bit misguided because it hides an important point, which is that in most organizations, when you see low levels of diversity, you also see very low retention rates for the groups that are less represented. And what I would argue is that it's a bit like a leaky bucket. The problem is not so much that we're not hiring enough people from diverse backgrounds or people with disabilities or people who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. It's a problem that these people are more likely to leave because we're not treating them the same way as other employees. And what I've been able to show in my book is two things. One of them is that there is a way to measure inclusion by measuring the experiences and how those experience in the workplace and how those experiences differ between different groups of people. But then more importantly, I was able to show, and this goes back to the business case point, I was able to show how having different groups of people with different levels of satisfaction means that the groups that are less satisfied will produce less, which means that it has a negative impact on your top line, and they will be more likely to leave your company, which has a negative impact on your cost, which means that altogether, you're literally shooting yourself in the foot. You're losing money invisibly simply by virtue of the fact that some groups of people are treated less well than others. And this is a completely different argument than the one that is typically used for the business case, in quotes, of DEI, which tends to focus more on large scale correlations, which, correlations are kind of a questionable thing to use anyway.
Yeah.
But more importantly, they tend to focus on things that cannot really tell an individual leader what they should do in their organization. And instead, I go to a leader and I will say, forget the, sprinkle the magic diversity dust and all kinds of magical things will start to happen. What we say is we can measure where and how much money you're losing today, and we can pinpoint exactly what you can do to stop losing that money. So it's a bit like the people that will look at your utility bills and say, hey, you're wasting your money because you're paying too much for the subscription. And that's essentially what we're doing. And that really completely flips the argument. It's not about diversity. It's not about targets. It's about you having efficiencies because of the way that you're making some of your employees less satisfied, and that costs you money.
Okay, so oh gosh, there's so many angles I could go at there, but why don't we stay with the business case? Because generally we're talking to an HR audience, and for them to make a case to the people who hold the purse strings, you do need to have a business case. So why don't you share a little bit about the benefits, the tangible benefits that you could evidence through your approach, and then you can tell us how your approach is different as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the tangible benefit actually comes from really thinking about the whole problem in a slightly different way. I found data, and a lot of my data happens to be centered on the United States, but I know that there are similar data from other countries. In the United States, companies across all of the United States in 1 year have been spending around, I think right now it's around $350 billion on advertising. When you look at how much money the same company spend annually on payroll and benefits, it's around $11 trillion. It's about 30 times as much. And the ratio has stayed fairly consistent, at least over the last 10 years, if not more. So to me, what that says is people are the single most valuable asset of any organization, but they're also the most expensive budget item. And if you think about how much time and energy organizations spend optimizing their advertising, it's a mystery to me that they don't try to spend at least 30 times as much, or at least 5 times as much, on figuring out how to optimize kind of the mix of their human assets. And so if you think of it from that perspective, again, I'd really like to look at the business argument from a very different perspective. And I think that one of the challenges that we are addressing, partly in this book and partly in the new book that I'm writing, is to show how you can bring together HR and finance, which unfortunately in most organizations have been very disjoint, right? I mean, on the finance side, you tend to treat people as a liability on the balance sheet and as a cost. And so what you do is you rarely think about what is going to be the emotional, psychological implications, and how is that going to impact things like retention, et cetera. So what you do is you make a decision based on finance, and then you dump the responsibility on HR to do what they can to keep people happy. Conversely, in HR, somebody may have an idea for, oh, here's what we can do to make our employees more satisfied. They may be able to calculate the cost of an initiative, but it's virtually impossible for them to estimate what is the financial impact that the CFO cares about. I am bringing those two worlds together. And the way that we do it is and it's actually really surprisingly simple from that perspective, which is that we know there's a lot of evidence that can tell you how a decrease in satisfaction by a certain level impacts work product. And so if I can calculate numbers, if I know how much revenue per employee you're generating and how much of that is dependent on the actual acts of the employee, and I can get at least a ballpark estimate of how decreasing, let's say, satisfaction by 10% decreases that number, I can tell you exactly how much money you're losing because of lost productivity. And then on top of that, if I know, for example, that let's say you have a company where the retention rate for men is 90% on an annual basis, while for women it is 80%. Well, that means that you're losing 10% more women per year than you should, simply because of the fact that you're not treating women the same way as men. Well, if you have 1,000 women, and let's say that their average salary is, just to make it easy, 100,000 pounds a year, then quite literally you're losing 10% of that, which is 100 women times 100,000 pounds a year. That's a lot of money. That's 10 million pounds a year that you're losing just because of increased attrition rates. So when you combine those two, we estimate that in most companies, given sort of the average levels of satisfaction of men, women, white people versus people of color here in the United States, immigrants versus, whatever buckets of diversity you have. But we estimate that it's common for companies to be losing 20% or more of their net profits to this invisible loss that has to do with poor inclusion. And that, from an HR perspective, one of my goals is I want to get to the point where the HR leaders are able to use these simple concepts and some of the tools that we developed to measure the right metrics and to be able to link them to the financial KPIs that will ultimately not just get the attention of the chief financial officer and of the chief executive officer, but that will actually enable them to speak the same language and be able to come up with joint ideas on how to manage their talent strategically.
So you're saying this is the book that you're writing that you're talking about, as opposed to Measuring Inclusion, the book that's out of the moment. You're saying that it's very much about productivity, being able to link the cost of productivity or lost productivity largely down to attrition, that attrition due to people not feeling included. Is that what you're saying?
So two things. I mean, first of all, just to be clear, the argument about the link between satisfaction and financial KPIs is already made very clear in the book on Measuring Inclusion. And I talk about that. We show a calculator that we developed that's actually available on my company's website it's free of charge. People can use it. We can do a customized version, but it literally, you can plug in how much money your company makes, how many employees you have, what are some of the main, buckets, like demographic buckets of employees, and what are their satisfaction or engagement levels, and use that to estimate how much money you might be losing. So there is that aspect of it. The second book that I'm working on, actually, you might appreciate, the title is actually Meritocracy. And which may seem a bit counterintuitive because meritocracy is often seen as being in opposition to DEI. But what my colleagues and I realize is that most people want the same thing. They want to make sure that if you are going to be hired, you should be able to get hired. And then after you get hired, you should be able to advance and succeed as an individual based on your skills and your contributions, not based on what you look like or who is your dad or what kind of a social status you have. And what we realize is that that's a different way of looking at what we were calling equity in the first book, which is to say, look, if I look at things like promotions, if I look at things like bonuses or project assignments, those things should not depend on your identity. And what do you call an organization in which those outcomes do not depend on your identity or relevant factors? You call that a meritocracy. That's what a meritocracy is all about. And so we are kind of showing that far from being the opposites that they've been painted to be, meritocracy and DEI really share a lot of foundational beliefs. And it's just that the assumptions that are made, which reflect the experiences that people have that are different, cause some of this tension. So really with the book on meritocracy, we're trying to do two things. We're expanding the vocabulary and the metrics. Inclusion is extremely important because it measures experiences at the individual level. Merit is very important because it measures differences in outcomes and how they may depend on differences in identity. And when you put all of them together, we call that inclusive meritocracy. And we argue that you kind of need both of them, and we show how that can be linked to the financial outcomes of the organization. So it's a very ambitious project in the sense that we're trying to redefine talent management in a way that can really close that gap between HR and finance that I mentioned earlier by providing a combination of simple concepts, simple tools, simple metrics, and more importantly, a consistent framework that can be applied throughout the organization in a way similar to the way that we manage finance, right? Imagine somebody saying, oh, I don't want to file an expense report. Or, oh, I don't want to, as a leader, imagine that you're the manager of a division and you say, I don't want to deal with a budget. That's a waste of my time. Well, if instead of thinking about diversity, you think about the value of your human assets, that's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, think of your human assets the way that you think of your financial assets. You should be able to measure different things at different levels. You should be able to roll it up so that each level has their own view of what matters so that they can react at the proper level. And all of that should be rolled up to the executive team who will look at high level numbers like diversity and inclusion, et cetera, and then be able to decide, is our organization healthy or do we need to do something about it? And if there's a problem, then they can drill down and figure out what happens. So it's a very, again, it's a very ambitious project. But one of the things that makes me very happy, and in the beginning of measuring inclusion, I have a quote that I'm actually going to read because I don't want to botch it by heart. But I have a quote that says, it's from Professor Carver Mead, who was somebody that is a fairly famous person from Caltech, California Institute of Technology. And he says, it's easy to have a complicated idea, but it's very, very hard to have a simple idea. Often that means thinking about things in new ways that aren't just the way that everybody else is thinking. And I think that really, really captures, what makes me very proud about my work is that we're really taking what seem like really complicated ideas and making them super simple just by viewing things in a different way.
So that's a really good link then. So what is this for the audience here who haven't read your book? What would you say the simple idea is that the central premise, and why is it different?
No, that's a great question. The fundamental difference is that when people talk about inclusion, or often we hear the word belonging, for example, there is a confusion as to, are we talking about the feelings of inclusion of an individual? Are we talking about a company being inclusive? And in the first case, the problem is that your feelings of inclusion are the result of everything that happens to you in the workplace and of your own personal life experiences. Something that upsets one individual may not upset a different individual based on their background and based on how often they're exposed to a particular situation. And from the point of view of the organization, likewise, it's like it's very, what exactly does it mean? People talk about culture as if it's, a plaque on the wall that says this is what our culture is like, but really a culture is sort of the result of everything that happens in the organization. And what we do is we say, look, let's go one level lower. Instead of looking at the feelings that people have, instead of looking at this macroscopic notion of culture or of, a culture of inclusion, let's look at the actual experiences of things that happen to people in the workplace. And so when we measure inclusion, the way that we do it is that we invite people, we do kind of an educational workshop where we teach some of these general ideas, and then we invite people to use a very simple platform where they can optionally share some identity traits and job-related things like, do you work remotely or hybrid or on-site, and how many years have you been in the organization? And they can, if they choose, provide some demographic data, and that depends on the country and whether it's legal or not legal, et cetera, right? And then what we do is we say, tell us experiences of things that happened to you at work that interfered with your ability to do your work. And we're very careful. We don't want to say that made you feel excluded because that's subjective sometimes. But so somebody might say, for example, my boss, my manager keeps forgetting to invite me to meetings that actually have an impact on me. Well, if you have in a company, you have 200 people that raise that issue, and of those 200, 150 happen to be women, then that the company is not being inclusive in the sense that they're allowing different groups of people to have different experiences for reasons that have nothing to do with their skills or their contributions. And so that's essentially what we do is we ask people to share these experiences. We have a very simple way of categorizing them in terms of, does this have to do with work-life balance? Does it have to do with compensation and benefits? Does it have to do with career and growth? We have the very simple list of categories that people will write an experience, that will categorize it. And then we have a couple of other questions that we ask. And based on that, we get a combination of quantitative data that will say, for example, your organization has a big issue with respect, and it tends to impact 28% of your population, but it is particularly acute among women and people of color. And then when you look at the descriptions, you can say, look at this. We're finding that a lot of people are complaining about not being invited to meetings. And that suggests a very simple solutions. Create a process whereby every manager has to have a spreadsheet of all the people that should be included in every meeting. And they should check it every time there is a meeting. And we're going to check their performance. If we find that a manager is consistently forgetting, we can hold them accountable for that. So now you're not holding the manager accountable for low levels of diversity of the whole company, which is kind of ludicrous. You're saying, this is what you're contributing to the success of the organization by excluding people whether you're doing it accidentally or voluntarily, you are damaging the value of our human assets. You're reducing, it's like you're spending money, right? You're basically decreasing the value of our individual employees. And that accumulates over the course of the year through the organization, and it's causing us to lose money. And so it's a very, very different. So it's about looking at experiences rather than emotions or feelings. And it's about measuring things at the right level so that people can actually see what is happening and what needs to be done.
So you're basically saying that inclusion it isn't about feelings, it's about measuring the experiences that people are having and looking at the data against different different groups to see whether people are getting different experiences. So that's where it would overlap.
Yes, with a slight clarifications. I am not necessarily saying that inclusion is one versus the other. I'm saying that if you define inclusion in terms of individual feelings, I think it's a dead end because you're basically left with, think about how many companies they do their pulse surveys, right? Or engagement surveys. And lo and behold, they find that women are less likely to feel included in the company than men, and that Black people are less likely to feel included than white people. But it doesn't tell you why, and maybe you have people write some open-ended questions, but then there's, psychological safety issues and things like that. So we are simply saying, if we define inclusion from the point of view of the organization, and the organization asks, what are we doing as an organization that is not inclusive, right? That's what we're doing. And by doing that, so we're measuring how experiences are different for different groups, and it can be demographics, but it doesn't have to be. You might find, for example, that, in fact, in one company, we found that people who work remotely had significantly worse inclusion scores than people who worked on site, either because certain programs were only available to them, or because they were not getting paid as much attention by the managers, or they were not getting as many raises and things of that sort, right? So in other words, yes, we are redefining inclusion in a very careful and measurable way from the point of view of the organization, so that the organization can then tap into the experiences of the individuals to understand exactly where the problems are and what they need to do about it. And when you then couple that with a financial link where we say, hey, those 28% of the people that are impacted by this, well, we believe that their satisfaction is impacted by 5%, which means that you're losing £7 million a year because of that, given the size of your organization. And it's that complete picture that really, really creates a very different perspective. And again, I'd like to bring the analogy to the way that we manage financial assets. You need to start by measuring, where am I spending money and where am I bringing money in? That's number one. Then you worry about your P&L. Well, is this department being profitable or is it losing money? And then you worry about the balance sheet and you say, well, over the course of the year, how many assets have I accumulated? How many liabilities have I accumulated? And am I ahead of the curve? And we can do exactly the same thing with people, right? You measure inclusion, that's like your cash flow. You measure what we're now calling meritocracy or merit, which is kind of what we were calling equity before, but it's the same idea. It's like the P&L. You're kind of saying, am I promoting people fairly? Am I giving raises fairly? Am I assigning projects fairly? Which is not about individual biases. It's about how the organization is doing it. And then at the macroscopic level, like the balance sheet, you can look at your diversity and say, do I have too many people of one type or another? Or do I have not enough people? Do I see some imbalances? So it's really, again, I really like the fact that, to me now, it just seems so clear and simple. It's like, yeah, we can manage people the way that we manage financial assets. We can link the two. And we can do it in a way that, instead of focusing on, fairness and justice, which they motivate me. I'm motivated by fairness, by justice, by equality, by things of that sort. But I understand that if you're the CEO of a company or the manager of a team, you can think about that, but that's not what determines your performance. That's not what determines whether you're going to get paid or whether your company is going to go bankrupt.
So, in taking on board that it's absolutely the thing to focus on. You've got good financial benefits for this. For HR leaders listening here, and you pinpointed a specific example, and I do appreciate this would vary from organisation to organisation, that people were feeling left out of meetings, so that impacted. If you were to sort of give some top tips to HR professionals who haven't necessarily got ready to, they're not ready to measure inclusion at the moment, but they want to improve inclusion, what sort of things could they do?
My first suggestion would be, so a couple of things that I want to clarify. One of them is, there is no silver bullet. And I have people that come to me, it's like, what are the top things that we can do? And they're expecting me to say, oh, change this to that. Every company is like a unique ecosystem. It's incredibly complex. And it's like expecting, oh, tell me the three things that you can do to guarantee that I will sell all of my products at, great margins. It's like, well, if I had that answer, I would be a billionaire and I wouldn't be sitting here, right? But what we can do is we can tell people, first of all, again, don't focus as an HR person. Keep in mind people's feelings and emotions, but instead of making that the goal, really think about how can I maximize the probability that this person will be able to do their work without interference, right? So it's really about shifting the focus from feelings and emotions to what are the causes, what are the actual experiences, what are the behaviors, what are the processes and the policies that we have in place that are causing some people to have a negative experience more so than other people. Because if we can pinpoint those, that will be a much better telltale of where you may have an opportunity to improve. So that would be my number one suggestion is really don't treat feelings as kind of like, a lot of people like, there's feelings and then there's like financial performance. And it's like, well, you need to understand that both of those come out of the same thing. It's experiences at the individual level that leads to different feelings and different financial performance. And so I would say, think about that. If anybody wants to, one of the things that we do in the book is that we talk about a number of case studies. We have case studies that range from a small startup to a global pharmaceutical company. But we also have two chapters. So we talk about the way that we measure inclusion and the tools that we have developed that we use with our clients. But we have two chapters that are specifically for organizations that want to do this on their own, where we define the categories, we define what we call the sources, and we say, look, if you want to do it on your own, here are the steps that you can follow. We have a chapter that's called like the 6 steps to measure inclusion. And it's quite literally like a recipe book that says, here's how you can do it. And basically boils down to asking the right questions, involving the right stakeholders, making sure that you're categorizing questions in a way that you can actually get valuable information and not just simply about feelings of inclusions. And then also very important is how do you use it? Because this is by the way, another fundamental difference, and I apologize for the tangent. Diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of starts from identity and then tries to solve problems based on that. So let's find the most vulnerable groups. Let's figure out what problems they have. Let's fix them. Our approach is completely backwards. Forget that. Start with the biggest problems and fix them. And guess what? We've always found that the biggest problems tend to impact way more members of underrepresented groups than members of the majority. So as you start with you cluster the problems and you go from the biggest to the next biggest to the next biggest, you're pretty much guaranteed that you're going to be disproportionately helping the people that were the most excluded without having to point that out, right? So instead of categorizing people, you categorize problems. And that's another thing that I would highly recommend to people is try to get out of that mindset of, oh, let's find the most vulnerable population and fix problems for them, because that creates division. It makes people feel bad. Oh, why are you doing a pride parade instead of doing something for the disability community? Why are you focusing on race instead of focusing on the, veteran status? And we hear those complaints all the time. And then on top of that, you get a lot of people that are members of the majority. They're like, why the hell are we focusing on hiring women and people of color? What about us? My company doesn't care about me anymore. Poor me, I'm a white man and I don't count anymore. And we literally hear that in spite of the fact that there is overwhelming data that being white and male is still an enormous advantage in virtually any corporate context. And so I would say those are the two biggest things. Focus on the behaviors and don't start on identity, start on problems, and then let the identity kind of fall out as a result of that.
That's a very powerful, simple concept. So start with the problem and then and solve that. And I can see how that would link to financials. People are going to buy into that because it's sitting on the problem as opposed to a minority. But basically the principle is you are going to fix inclusion or improve all of those things if that is the case. I like that. Okay, so that's a great simple concept. We're reaching the end of our time here, but is there one other thing that maybe you'd say if people want to take something away from your book that you think is a great takeaway that people would get from it?
Well, I mean, I would say we talked about sort of the main topics. I think that one of the things that we found is that, especially with the case study with a smaller company, because there's been more time and they're smaller companies, nimble, they found something really interesting, which is that they actually did this on their own. So I literally worked with them pro bono. I was like, here, let me show you, give them a copy of the book. And I said, in fact, it was before the book came out. So I give them a copy of the ideas, that I give them a presentation. It's like, here, these are the ideas you can do. They ended up taking some of those ideas and basically asking questions in the right way within their annual surveys. And what they found is that in fact, there were annual surveys. And so in the span of 2 years, they were able to do 3 surveys, right? One at the beginning, then 1 year later, 2 years later. And each time they found the problem, they kind of drilled down, figure out what it was, they fixed it. Then when they went and measured back again, they found that that problem had largely gone away. They picked the next problem and fixed that one, and so on. And what they found were 2 things that were very interesting. The first one is that it had a huge impact on retention, to the point that apparently there was a situation in which the investors actually ousted one of the founders in a way that was kind of unexpected, which normally is known to be a great source of instability. And apparently, like, virtually nobody left the company because they were so specifically so happy about the way that the organization was working. But it also ended up working as a magnet, because a lot of people, when there were a lot of potential candidates, when they heard about what the company was doing, they all thought it was awesome. And apparently this really had a huge impact on their ability to recruit candidates. So that was one thing that we hadn't really thought about, because we think more about how do we convince the leaders to do the right thing and then measure the right data. But there are these sort of emergent, unexpected, not necessarily unexpected, but there are these emergent outcomes that it was very heartwarming to see that was happening, because it shows that, again, this is not simply about, you don't have to separate doing the right thing, nice to have, with doing the financial thing. Those 2 things, not only do they go hand in hand, but they can actually strengthen one another. And that's really, I think, and that's part of the subtitle of the book is Higher Profits and Happier People, without guesswork or backlash, but it's really about the fact that you should have both higher profits and happier people.
A chief DEI officer should be more chief problem fixer, in that you're saying that almost the subtlety is, by focusing on solving the biggest problems, you, rather than measuring DEI, you end up solving not only the problem, but also having all the positive benefits that you've been looking for in terms of DEI. I feel like it should correlate with engagement to a certain extent. Do you see a link between engagement surveys? Because a lot of those are similar. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that we've come to realize is that, people, actually, there was something that you mentioned earlier that didn't quite address directly, but this aspect of the link between like satisfaction, retention. Satisfaction, we use that term kind of generically. And by that, we mean, if you ask people to self-report on a scale of, from very dissatisfied to very satisfied, overall, how do you feel about your work? It's like, when you get up in the morning, are you like bouncing out of bed, can't wait to get to work? Or is it more like, oh my God, I can't wait to get the hell out of this company, right? So that is correlated to engagement levels, to sense of belonging, to sense of inclusion. And sometimes there are pieces of it, right? Some people say, well, your satisfaction, I'm less satisfied because I don't feel as included. It was like, well, yes and no. Things are happening to you at work that are making you feel less included, making you feel like you don't count. They're interfering with your work-life balance. Altogether, your overall sense is what I call satisfaction. And that is what we link to the finance. So to me, as a chief diversity and inclusion officer, one of the things that you could learn to do is to measure the right things so that you know how to connect the satisfaction of your employees with the kinds of numbers that your other fellow chief executives actually care about. And I really firmly believe that, just as, if you think about 20 years ago, the chief marketing officer was not at that same table. They were very much the way that the chief diversity officer is today. Chief marketing officer used to be, you got 12% of the budget, go spend it and figure out how to do it. The advent of the internet changed that dramatically because of one reason, in my opinion, because it made it possible to quantify the impact of advertising on consumers. Now, what I'm proposing is we're trying to quantify the impact of inclusion on your employees. And imagine, again, if you think about the scale between how much money we spend on advertising and how much we spend on employees, imagine if we can crack that nut and link the value of your employees to your, the happiness of your employees to the financial performance of your company. At that point, the chief diversity officer, chief HR officer, anybody that's managing HR, DI, culture, people, talent, any of those titles, they should become the single most important strategic function of every organization.
And that's a great place to end. I'm sure lots of people out there would agree with you there. But Paolo, if people would like to get in touch with you, obviously they can get your book available at all good bookstores and online, and Measuring Inclusion. You mentioned that you've got something that you can download from your website if people wanted to, the top tips and things like that. Do you want to tell us how they can find you and your website address, and we'll put that on the show notes as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So my company's website, the company's name is Aleria, Aleria, and the website is aleria.tech, TECH. And if you go there, there's a couple of, the navigation bar, there's some resources, and there you'll find, for example, the inclusion impact calculator, which I mentioned. You will find links to the kinds of things that we do and how we do them, I do a lot of public speaking as part of this and corporate training, both at the managerial level, at the leadership level. And then on a personal note, anybody that wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn, luckily with a name like Paolo Gaudiano, there are not that many. And so
Paolo, which is a Paolo.
That is correct. Paolo. It's the Italian version. I was born and raised in Italy, so it's the Italian, not the Portuguese version with a U. But so if you look me up, I'm relatively easy to find online. And if you do reach out to me on LinkedIn, please let me know that you heard about it on this podcast so that I will know the context. And more than happy to answer any questions that any of your listeners might be interested in sending my way.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Lucinda.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.
This episode was brought to you by Disruptive Media, helping bold entrepreneurs stand out through podcasting, video, and social content. Visit disruptivemedia.co.uk to learn more.